Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 16 of the devotion series We Are Called. I hope you've been enjoying these and learning a little bit about some of these old stories. Part 16, we're going to talk about the Prophet Ezra. We're going to read Ezra chapter 9, verses 5 to 15. It says, "At the evening sacrifice I got up from my fasting with my garments and my mantle torn, and fell on my knees, spread out my hands to the Lord my God, and said, O my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors to this day we have been deep in guilt, and for our iniquities we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to the kings of the land, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as is now the case. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God, who has left us a remnant and given us a stake in this holy place, in order that he may brighten our eyes and grant us a little sustenance in our slavery. For we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to give us new life, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judea and Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, The land that you are entering to possess is a land unclean with the pollutions of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations. They have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, so that you may be strong and eat the good of the land and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you destroy us without remnant or survivor? O Lord God of Israel, you are just, but we have escaped as a remnant, as is now the case. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can face you because of this." Here ends the reading. The next few prophets that we'll talk about all happened around the same time in the same places, so much so that it's hard to decide which one to talk about first. I chose Ezra, not because he was necessarily the next prophet, but because the book of Ezra forms part of the historical story that helps us lean into the other prophets. Basically, I'd have to talk about Ezra in order to talk about Haggai or Zechariah, so I may as well talk about Ezra first, because then you'll know what I'm talking about later. Ezra and Nehemiah are two books in our Bibles that were one book in Hebrew. Ezra talking about the prophet Ezra, and Nehemiah talking about the governor. They're closely related to the books of Chronicles, which again used to be just one book. Collectively, these four books of our Bible retell the history of God's people. It's a later, more edited retelling than the King's version, and it's from a different perspective. The book of Ezra focuses on this priest, who also claims to be a prophet, as one of the community leaders who has returned from the Babylonian exile to Jerusalem around 539 BC. The book itself, though, wasn't completed until more than 100 years later, so we have no idea how much is and how much became, if you know what I mean. The first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra pick up the history from the end of Chronicles and records the story of the return from exile. How Cyrus of Persia, who had defeated the Babylonians, decreed that the people, now called Jews after their homeland of Judah, as well as Israelites, could return to their home. They were no longer required to be dispersed through the empire, but could return and restructure their own community, as long as they remembered who was in charge and who they owed taxes and military aid to. It wasn't a free rein. So, like they tried to do throughout all of the histories, they keep the list of the families that returned to Jerusalem. There's actually two different genealogies. The first thing that they did when they returned, according to Ezra, was rebuilt the altar in Jerusalem so that they could return to the sacrificial system. And then they started to rebuild the temple. On the one hand, this seems like a great thing to do, right? Rebuild your church, have that local worship system in place. But in reality, the local residents, those who had moved into the barren land after the Israelites were taken away, opposed this project out of fear that if the city and the country and the temple were rebuilt, the Jews would rebel again like they always did. So the Persian king actually forbade them from rebuilding the city and the temple for many years. Eventually, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, who we'll talk about over the next few weeks, along with some planners, Zerubbabel and Yeshua, convinced the new king Darius to allow the work to continue. So the temple was completed and worship of the Lord resumed. In chapters 7 to 10, after all these things, the priest Ezra brought back a second group of released exiles to Jerusalem. There's another genealogy as people returned, which only means anything if you're looking for your family's name. As it is, we fail to connect with these genealogies because they're not our families. It's like watching somebody else's vacation pictures. It's only so interesting so many times. The last two chapters, chapters 9 and 10, are the story of Ezra as a prophet. And I have to admit, the reason why I despise this book and consider Ezra a false prophet, one who does not speak for God or God's ways. These chapters are written from a first-person perspective, as if Ezra himself wrote it. He describes how he attempts to purify the people after the temple has been rebuilt. But the way he does this is by outlawing mixed marriages. Marriages between a Jewish man or woman with a spouse of another nationality. Ezra declared that these marriages were illegal, immoral, and wrong. It's this part of the story that our reading came from. The reason he was fasting with his garments torn in grief was he was so upset that these nice Jewish girls were married to some random Egyptian or Moabite. He considered this was the reason why the city was originally invaded and destroyed. The reason for the exile, the reason why any bad happens to anyone, is that they married the wrong person. Not like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or all the other prophets kept going on and on, that it was the problems of the Israelites themselves, especially the problems built in about rich taking advantage of the poor. No, Ezra considered these mixed marriages to be the ultimate sin against God. And this prophecy of Ezra has been used by both racist laws prohibiting intermarriages of people of different cultures and backgrounds, and religious strife, excommunicating people for marrying that Catholic girl or that Lutheran boy. I even heard those warnings from my own family growing up. You have to be careful about who you marry. Ezra claims to accomplish his goal of banishing not only the foreign spouses, but also the children produced by those mixed marriages in order for the bloodline of the people to be made pure. But other prophets like 3rd Isaiah and other writings like the Book of Ruth argue that Ezra was not only wrong in theory, but failed in practice. The people didn't forsake their wives and husbands, their children and grandchildren, because this one person was so worried about this particular definition of what holy living should look like. Honestly, it all reminds me of Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18, where a Pharisee, right, the leading expert on God's ways, goes to worship and prays that he is thankful he is not like those sinners, like this tax collector here. Meanwhile, the tax collector is only asking God for mercy. Ezra puts himself in the role of the Pharisee, of thanking God he's not like those people. Yes, there is a standard for holy living, and we must always struggle with how and why to live according to God's commandments. But none of God's commandments have to do with the race, nationality, or even religious practices of a spouse. You could argue back then that they just assumed everyone was going to marry their neighbor's cousin, friend's, uncle, whatever. Today, many people choose to marry within their own religious traditions, but many others choose the variety. Regardless of that specific example, our goal should always be to act in God's ways, proclaiming Jesus' love for everyone, regardless of where they came from or where they're going. I really and truly believe that the faithful life of following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Christian life that has been adopted into that ancient tradition, is the lifelong struggle to get beyond the Ezra within each of us and move to a life of grace and love. Now, I don't have a nice ending for Ezra. I've read so many attempts to rationalize his work. He was an instructor, he was a teacher, declaring the importance of holy living. And I suppose if you ignore the overt racism and prejudice, you could read it that way. But we ignore racism to our own peril and to the suffering of others. We can learn the lessons that we do indeed have to live holy lives. But we also have to learn from the negative example that Ezra provides and reach beyond ourselves to see what God is really trying to do in the world. The ultimate end goal of God's work is salvation for each and every one of us. And I dream of the day when all of God's faithful people will fall in love with God's mission of salvation for everyone, as much as I rejoice in the knowledge of God's salvation for me and for you. And thanks be to God for that.